asking me about Mumia, and I ended up talking about MOVE, and he didn't know that much about MOVE. And I go on once I start talking about MOVE. So one of the things I always say is that the movement, the progressive movement, which took a long time really to recognize MOVE and its importance. Let's be honest. When I first started doing Mumia work in the early 90s, people kind of shied away from MOVE. People would say, okay, MOVE, or they'd whisper some things. And on May 13th, when we saw close to 2,000 people in that auditorium right here in Philadelphia honoring MOVE and remembering the bombing and the destruction of 1985, that was a major victory for MOVE and for our movement to finally understand the importance of MOVE. And one of the things I've always said is that this is before I give an update on Mumia, I just want to say a couple of things about MOVE. One of the things I've always said is that the movement has so much to learn from MOVE. I've been in the movement a long time, many, many decades. And the thing I talk about MOVE is not only the love that's radiated by everybody in MOVE, including all the way to the young children, but also the morality. The MOVE has a level of morality that, by and large, does not exist in that way in the rest of the movement. It just doesn't. Honesty, long-standing commitment, acceptance, building unity, principled behavior, all that kind of stuff is something that a movement that doesn't have that will not last over the long haul. Our movement has that to learn from MOVE. That kind of love. How many of us have seen the older generation of MOVE people hug us, receive us, comfort us under all kinds of conditions? That's something we need to honor and cherish and recognize. And I felt May 13th here in Philadelphia was a recognition of the contribution of MOVE. So right on, MOVE. May you continue forever and ever, and I'm sure you will, because it's a long struggle, and you understand that better than most people. In fact, walking into the museum here, I was saying that one day there are going to be photographs and pictures of MOVE all over this place. And you know how history honors people that it dishonored when they were alive, and dishonored at the crucial points of its struggle. But there's no question about it that the story of MOVE will go down in history as a powerful, significant example of the evil of the state and the glorious resistance of the people. And that will be in the museums across this country. So speaking of that, I just wanted to bring a picture of someone who was certainly not honored in his lifetime by the state, Emory Douglas. If you've seen our the Mumia Coalition's pins, are Emory Douglas's image of Mumia. He's on our t-shirts. I'm not wearing one today. I don't know if anybody is wearing the Free Mumia t-shirt, but it's a beautiful image with freedom on the bottom. Word freedom, that's all you see, and it's Mumia. Well, lo and behold, front page of the weekend art section of the New York Times yesterday. All power to the people. The Black Panther, he's carrying, the brother's carrying, young brother, a picture of the newspaper and selling it as the Panthers used to. And it's a picture by Emory Douglas being honored in the New York Historical Society, which is on 80th Street, I think, and Central Park West, a really rich museum in a rich neighborhood. And there's Emory Douglas being honored. He's fortunately still alive today and being honored in many museums. So MOVE, all these paintings, drawings, pictures will surely make it into the museums. Now, on to the issue of the current petition and everything that's happening with MOVE in terms of the new initiatives. There is a movement across the country, and I'm very aware of the one in New York because I'm a member of the prison ministry of the Riverside Church, which has been part of a movement which is backing off now. Let me whisper to you, Riverside Church is moving way to the right. So a lot of things that were very positive a few years back are being stolen back, but I'm still hanging in there for as long as I can. And one of the things that was initiated by a whole bunch of groups in New York State is a parole reform act called the Safe Parole Reform Act. And the heart of it, the essence of it, was that the initial crime cannot be considered at the time of parole. In other words, you've gone to prison for a crime, you've been there 20, 30 years, you cannot be resentenced 30 years later because of that original crime when you've already paid your debt on that. Whether you're guilty or not is not even the issue. But that is traditionally what's done in these parole hearings, and Pennsylvania is noteworthy for that. And the MOVE case is one of the outstanding examples in this country of raising the initial alleged crime again and again so as to deny parole. So there's a strong initiative in New York State right now on the Safe Parole Act, and that could have a tremendous impact over time in educating people and raising issues. And when I say Riverside has moved to the right, there's been an initiative within Riverside to undo that parole act and present another one that is not nearly as strong. So that's why for every step forward, the state tries to infiltrate, weaken us, and we have to watch the 2 steps they take backwards. But MOVE, I raise MOVE all the time when we talk about the New York State situation because people don't know that much about it and should. So the Safe Parole Act in New York, for those of us who come from New York, support it, educate people about it, talk about it in the rest of the country because it is a potentially breakthrough in terms of denying the right to the Parole Commission to look at the original crime. You're supposed to look at the record in prison, signs of positive growth, the ability to get a job when you get out. Are you going to be a threat to the community? All those, of course, they've had this ridiculous thing about Delbert being a threat to the community, and we know who the real threat to the community is. So I just wanted to mention those things. Now let's go on to Mumia. So Mumia's situation, as you know, came to head around in February of this year. Initially, what we heard was this horrible skin problem that he was developing, and he really on the initiative of a fellow inmate, a brother in prison, Major Tillery. Major Tillery went over to the guy who's head of the prison, who happened to be walking through, and he said, "Are you going to let Mumia die? Are you going to let him die? Look how sick he is. He belongs in the infirmary." And that's really what got Mumia in the infirmary. It was Major Tillery who got Mumia in the infirmary. Of course, Major Tillery has paid a huge price. He's in the hole right now.
Yes.
Rachel Walkenstein is fighting for him. There's all kinds of, as a lawyer, and there are many, many initiatives. But let's not forget the heroic act of a prisoner is what got Mumia the medical aid. So Mumia spends a week in the infirmary. They ultimately release him. He's sicker and sicker. The skin disease that he has is now itching worse. It's bleeding, it's spread, and they have no diagnosis. But what have they done? They've given him cortisone, all kinds of steroids, and in the process, the steroids have brought on, we found out later, a diabetic condition. But they don't tell him that. Even though they knew his blood pressure was dangerously high, they don't tell him that, they don't tell his family that, and worse, they don't treat him. March 30th, he ends up going into diabetic shock and is rushed to the hospital. That's the first time Mumia heard of diabetes. Everybody says, oh, he obviously had diabetes. Well, malpractice number one. I shouldn't even say number one, there were so many. but major, major malpractice to not let him know about the diabetes, about the high blood sugar, to not treat it, and to let him go until he was in diabetic shock. Very close to diabetic coma. And so when we saw that horrible picture of him, where so many people said, we're about to lose him. We're about to lose Mumia. He looks like he's dying. This was a total result of the malpractice of the Department of Corrections. And that's the heart of this case, that the Department of Corrections has controlled everything in his care from when he first got sick in February to this day. It's now 6 months. And guess what? At the end of all this, do you think they have a diagnosis? No diagnosis. These MFs who claim to be experts in medicine, who have sent him to now even a better hospital. I mean, the infirmary is a death trap, the infirmary. But they then sent him to a better place, a hospital, through the outcry of the movement. Mumia, let me just say, Mumia is only alive today because of the outcry of the international movement. Let me repeat it. There's no way he would be alive today if it had not been for the outcry of the international movement. That's what got him into Geisinger, which is the hospital that was a decent hospital, but they still could not diagnose him. And here it is months later. In the meantime, a team was developed. One is 2 lawyers, Brett Grody and Bob Boyle, and then his lawyers, Brett Grody was defending that free speech case before, and Bob Boyle was brought in recently because of his extensive experience with political prisoners. He got DeRupa out, he got Lynn Stewart out on this last round, he got Marshal Eddie Conway out. He's really had a very impressive history. And the doctors who were involved, one was in California, and several were included on conference calls from New York. The doctors had wanted to see Mumia under proper medical conditions, privately, even in a separate room with all the equipment and so on and so on. The Department of Corrections said no, and this is where the dynamic of the movement is so important. And so when the Department of Corrections said no, the doctors refused to go. They weren't going to go under those conditions. Well, we were screaming, Wadia, Mumia's wife in particular, was screaming, I'm seeing my husband dying right in front of my eyes. I visit him. I want a doctor to lay eyes on him, whether under ideal conditions or not. So that was the movement's demand. We couldn't force a doctor who didn't want to go, but we called a doctor in New York, Joseph Harris, who spoke at the press conference in New York, for those of you who were at the press conference, who had worked with Doctors Without Borders, who has traveled internationally and dealt with medical issues internationally. And we arranged for him to go in on a regular visit, like anyone visits, like you or I when we visit, to see Mumia. Well, here's the story. He immediately came up with a different hypothesis, a different diagnosis, not permanent because they hadn't been the blood test, they hadn't followed up, but he had a different hit on what he saw based on the international work he had done. He had seen patients he had read an article about patients with skin illnesses in Egypt, and particularly a situation that was affecting Black people. And his tentative diagnosis, we just saw him 2 weeks ago, was this is that kind of situation and needs to be pursued in several ways. Well, that was the first sign that we were absolutely right, that we had to take over this case and let Mumia's doctors take over this case and not let the Department of Corrections kill him. Right. If we leave it up to the Department of Corrections, Mumia will not only never get well, but he's likely to die at a much earlier age than he should, as many prisoners have, as 2 MOVE prisoners did, and that is their agenda. I mean, we've said it over and over again, what they could not do by legal means, what they could not do when they took him off death row, they were now trying to kill him medically. We can't prove it exactly. What we can say is that the level of malpractice in this case was so horrendous that now the lawyers, we've been pushing the lawyers for months and months and months. Betsy knows, those of us who've been on some of the conference calls know how much we've been pushing them to file more papers. And Raza Khan was really the hero of this struggle.
Yeah.
He was adamant, and this is what we all have to remember, that the words of the lawyers are not the final truth. The power of the truth is final, but the power of the lawyers cannot be final. And their reluctance to file initially was definitely a mistake, but now they are filing, and the accumulated information of all the neglect has been practiced is now, they're now saying, if you don't hand them over to us, we're ready to file a much more aggressive move at this point. And so that's where we're at now. We have a tentative diagnosis, and I can't go into all of the details because we have to really respect Mumia's privacy, but they have some thoughts about what it is. This doctor came up with something, and one of the treatments for it, amazingly enough, is zinc, something that you can buy over the counter, that he thinks could really help significantly, and they've already petitioned to get zinc available for Mumia right away. So that was a major breakthrough for the movement, a big victory for the activists who kept saying, we cannot just leave it up to the doctors and the lawyers. And that dynamic is a heavy dynamic, as all of you know who've been in this struggle for a while, not only Mumia's case, MOVE's case, every political prisoner, and even non-political prisoners. You know, what a legal strategy is, and in this case, somebody who's sick, a medical strategy. So we're pursuing this Dr. Joseph Harris's thesis, hypothesis, and we hope to see if this is effective, and also the pursuit of the legal strategy is about to escalate. One of the things we want in this period too, and it's almost like we wage the external battle against the enemy, but internally you have to have a strong, unified movement, and if you don't fight on important issues, it weakens all of us. So we've been fighting that we get the information that we need to know what's happening. For the first time in the last few weeks, the lawyers are sending us the documents before they file them, so we can have input. And it's not been just BS, they really have taken our input seriously. So I'm very optimistic, well, I should say not very optimistic. We always say I'm cautiously optimistic about the recent developments, what's possible. We don't yet have an answer. There's no question that until we have a diagnosis, one that has really led to the proper treatment, we are not out of the danger situation. Even with a diagnosis, of course, you have to make sure the treatment works. But we have made some advances in this period, and I think all of us who are close to this feeling encouraged as compared to about a month ago.
Before you leave, Suzanne, you might want to put in the footnote that the legacy of the struggle for Lynn Stewart's case, the daughter of Ralph Pointer and Lynn Stewart, was one of the doctors who gave the summation and gave a diagnosis that she felt there was a case for medical neglect, and that's Dr. Zenobia Brown.
Right, Lynn's daughter.
Long before the doctor from Doctors Without Borders. And they used the same strategy that Ralph used in Lynn's case, which, as you know, it was 18 months. And she went in with a serious diagnosis of cancer, she was due for an operation, and it was 18 months before they got there. And it's from that we coined the phrase death camps. We no longer have prisoners. We want to ask people to stop using the term prison and start using the term death camps, because this is clearly death through medical neglect. But I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Zenobia Pointer Brown.
And she's on the team. She's on the team.
And she was one that risked everything and gave that initial diagnosis based on what she could see and demanded as much as possible from the prison authorities.
And even though We are, of course, thrilled. We were, of course, all thrilled at Lynn's release from prison. But it's very important to note a couple of differences between Lynn's case and Mumia's. Number one, there was a diagnosis of cancer with Lynn.
Exactly.
Number two, she came out on
Medical.
what's it called?
Compassionate release.
Compassionate release, which is you have to say that the person's going to die within 6 months. You cannot say that about Mumia, hopefully. And he also has no diagnosis. So, and finally, Lynn is an older white woman, and we have to remember, revolutionary that she is and all that, there's still a significant difference. Mumia is a black man with a long history in the black movement. So when people say, why don't we do what was done with Lynn, people should understand it's not exactly the same, and we have to pay attention to many factors. So I'm sure there are a lot of questions. I don't have magical answers. This is where we're at this point, and again, I thank you all for coming, for your support for MOVE, and for Mumia, of course.